Hello everyone, it's Mr. Carroll here with another video in my Pandemic and Public Health series. Today we are going to be looking at pandemics in the ancient Mediterranean. Now if you read primary sources from this area, you will discover that there were a lot of plagues, pestilences, and scourges occurring throughout the region at all the time. This was just the nature of disease in the ancient world. Because there were no antibiotics or vaccines, lots of people would get sick. But for today, we are going to look at just 4 of the major ones in this region. Also, you will notice that the authors use the term plague often, but they do not mean the disease caused by the Y. pestis bacteria. Plague is just the term they use for a pandemic. So let's begin. The first pandemic we will talk about is the Plague of Athens, that occurred from 430 B.CE to 426 B.CE, right at the start of the Peloponnesian War. This plague did affect all of Greece, but because an Athenian wrote about it, the historical record is skewed towards Athens. The author, Thucydides, was writing a history of the Peloponnesian War, and so included the plague in the narrative, but he focuses mostly on what the symptoms were, where it came from, and how it affected the Athenians' abilities to fight Sparta. According to him, it originated in Ethiopia and moved through trade networks north to Egypt and Libya, and then entered the port of Piraeus to infect Athens. This is a common thing with all diseases at this time, that they spread through ships and trade routes, since those are the fastest modes of transportation. We will see it happen again with the 3 other pandemics in this slideshow, and that's also how the Black Death in the 14th century and the diseases of the Columbian Exchange moved around. Now, because the Spartans had just invaded Attica, the area around Athens, Pericles had ordered all the people into the walls of the city. We know that social distancing is one way to stop the spread of disease, and clearly no one was social distancing while crowded together trying to be protected from these Spartan soldiers. We do know it was the first time anyone had seen this illness, because Thucydides writes that the physicians were ignorant of its nature, they were helpless. We also know that social norms started to break down. Thucydides also says that the catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen next to them, became indifferent to every rule of religion or law. But beyond that, we don't really know a lot about what the average Athenian felt like during the plague. This is very different from later pandemics like the 1918 flu, where people wrote about it in newspaper articles, books, and poems. Or how you were writing in journals about COVID-19. People today still want to know what disease actually caused the Plague of Athens, but no one knows. It may have been typhus or measles or smallpox, but we're never really going to know for sure. The next pandemic is the Antonine Plague, called this because the family of Antoninus Pius was ruling at the time, or the Galen Plague because the Dr. Galen wrote about it in his book of medical practices. It occurred in several waves between 165 to 190 CE, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, who both also died of the pandemic. It seems to have originated along the Silk Road somewhere in Han, China, because they also write about a plague happening out there. And it spread to the Roman army during the siege of Seleucia on the Tigris River, and then the Roman army spread it all over to their forts, and then from there to the civilian populations. Some people even think that it led to the fall of the Roman Empire, but really that's a bit reductionist to think that one thing brought down an entire empire. If you hear anyone talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, you'll always hear it's a multitude of things causing the problem. Now, Galen wrote about the symptoms and how to treat it, and other authors looked for the cause of the disease. Ammianus Marcellinus, a historian, claimed that Lucius Verus opened a tomb in Seleucia during the sacking of the city and released the disease. He also writes that a soldier opened a golden casket in the temple of Apollo in Babylon that allowed the disease to escape. Now, besides the clear connection that I see between these stories and the ending scene of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, it also shows a connection with the myth of Pandora opening her box or jar and releasing illnesses into the world. It also continues to show that Romans think disease is a punishment for bad behavior, that doing something the gods don't want will cause them to bring illness to you. We find other Romans blaming Christians for making the gods angry, which caused the outbreak, as another common theme in writing at this time. But all these stories just show that they don't understand where disease came from. We do know that the plague was destructive. Eutropius, a historian, said that all Rome and throughout Italy and the provinces, the greater part of the inhabitants and almost all the troops sunk under the disease. Although, again, we don't know how the farmer or merchant fared, we do know that they weren't doing well. From the archaeological record, we find lots of amulets that were the attempts of people to ward off the pandemic. And we also know that it harmed the vulnerable populations of Rome first. Galen said that the plague killed all of his slaves at his house in Rome, which also implies that he had more than one home. And the philosopher Aelius Aristides reports that the plague infected his neighbors at Smyrna, and then 2 or 3 of his slaves grew sick, and then all were in bed, both the younger and the older. From the writings, we know that this really harmed the army, since in the Historia Augusta, which is a series of biographies, we find out that Marcus Aurelius recruited slaves for the war that he was fighting, as had been done in the Punic War, which is to say over 400 years ago. So it's not a common thing for Roman emperors to do. And he even armed gladiators, whom he called the obedient or the obsquentes, which is another big no-no since Spartacus rebelled about 200 years prior. But Marcus Aurelius was desperate. But you'll notice all of these stories about the slaves and the gladiators are all coming from the leaders and what they did, and we don't know how the soldiers felt during all this, or even the slaves and gladiators who were forced to become soldiers. Now again, as in the other plagues we're going to see today, people still want to know which disease caused all this harm, but no one knows. It may have been measles or smallpox. And it's sad because we even had a doctor writing about it, but we're never going to know for sure. Our next pandemic is the Plague of Cyprian, named for the Bishop Cyprian of Carthage who wrote about it. It happened from 249 to 262 CE. Just like the Plague of Galen, it caused shortages of food since farmers got ill, and shortages of soldiers to defend the empire. It also may have killed a few Roman emperors, but that we're not really sure. Like the other pandemics, writers share what the symptoms were and how it changed the political climate of the time period. But not much is known about how it affected people. Although, luckily, we do have a fragment of a letter that was discovered in Egypt, where this gentleman named Pausanias writes to his brother Heraclides and says, "Brother, please write to me about your family's safety, since I heard that there is a plague in your part of the city. So don't forget to write to me so that I can be happier about you. Say hello to my mother. I pray that the whole household stays well." So we see that there's general concern amongst the people. But again, it's only one piece of evidence. We know a lot more about what the Roman emperors felt and did than we do about the regular person. Most of the record about the Plague of Cyprian is stuff like what Pontius, the biographer of Cyprian, wrote, which was, afterwards there broke out a dreadful plague, an excessive destruction of a hateful disease, invaded every household in succession of the trembling populace. Or we find a general fear, like what St. Dionysius, the Bishop of Alexandria, wrote when he said, "But when both we," meaning the Christians, and they, meaning the pagans, had been allowed a tiny breathing space, out of the blue came this disease, a thing more terrifying to them than any terror, more frightful than any disaster whatsoever. Notice that he also kind of is starting to point out the difference between the Christians and the pagans here. And he's saying we Christians handled this well. This is when we start to see the church leaders saying that illnesses are God's test of Christians' faith. Cyprian, the bishop who this plague is named after and whose reliquary we see here, said, "What a grandeur of spirit it is to struggle with all the powers of an unshaken mind against so many onsets of devastation and death. What sublimity to stand erect amid the desolation of the human race, and to not lie prostrate with those who have no hope in God." We see that there's a lot more saying that the Christians are stronger because of their faith, and they're able to kind of stand up against these plagues. We also find that this time a lot of Christians are starting to reach out towards to helping others. Although that's not to say the pagans don't either. We just see that that's a thing that the bishops are kind of writing about, that they're saying that their flock and their people should be reaching out and helping those who are ill. And yet again, we don't know what it was. It maybe was smallpox or influenza. We're not really sure, but it does point to the fact that diseases from animals are probably jumping over to humans at this time because of we're encroaching on the animal's environment. We know this because of genealogical records being done on diseases that we can tell that right about this time, that's where these diseases are originating from. So our last pandemic is the Justinian Plague. Again, it's named because it started during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I in 541. But this one also came back in cycles for almost 200 years until about 750 CE. Like the other plagues, it spread via trade routes. It seems to have originated along the Silk Road in India and was spread by the army. Justinian at the time was trying to reconquer Italy, so he could rule the whole Roman Empire again. And the plague may have stopped their success. But the army was the quickest means of spreading this plague around. This is one of the first ones that we can say more or less that we know what disease it was because of forensic anthropology done on graves from this time period. It seems that it was caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacteria that would come back and cause the Black Death in medieval Europe. We know that people were using prayer and amulets and quarantining the sick to try and slow the disease. We also have a few more stories about how regular people felt or were treated during this time. Procopius, who was in the emperor's court and the writer of the official history, writes about the issues that the treasury had that were caused by the plague. He said it wiped out most of the farming community and of necessity leaving a trail of desolation in its wake. And Justinian showed no mercy towards the ruined landowners. Even then, he did not refrain from demanding the annual tax. Not only the amount at which he assessed each individual, but also the amount for which his deceased neighbors were liable to pay. Now, it shows that the farmers were being really, really pushed at this time. But again, it's showing how the emperor had to deal with it. We also know that people were scared. John of Ephesus, one of the leaders of the Syriac Orthodox Church, said, "When they were obliged to go out, the one who went out, either to accompany or to bury the dead, wrote a tablet with these words that he hung on his arm. I am so-and-so, son of so-and-so, and neighbor of this person. If I die, for God's sake, and to show his mercy and goodness, let them know at my house, and let my people come to bury me." It shows that there's a lot of fear amongst the people, but there's still this Christian attitude of needing to help your neighbor. We also hear what happens when people don't stay at home. Evergius Scholasticus, in his ecclesiastical history, shared that the ways in which the disease were communicated were various and unaccountable, for some perished by merely living with the infected, others by only touching them, others by having entered their chamber, others by frequenting public places. Some, having fled from the infected cities, escaped themselves but imparted the disease to the healthy. Some were altogether free from contagion, though they were associated with many who were afflicted, and had touched many not only in their sickness but also when dead. So you can see that he's kind of saying that the quarantines were helping and it stopped spreading the disease. But again, it's being written from a leader's point of view, not necessarily from the people who might have been fleeing or burying the dead that were writing this. But as you can see through our short stroll through pandemic history, in a very limited geographic area, that there are some things that people keep talking about, like symptoms, how the army and the rulers were affected, speculation on why the disease came and how it spread. And only rarely do we get to see how the regular farmer, miner, fisherman was affected, and we almost never hear the stories of women, children, or slaves. This has obviously changed a lot over the centuries, as printing has become more common and more people are literate. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 will have even more, with TikTok videos, podcasts, and student journals like your own for future historians to read, watch, and listen, and piece back together to paint a picture of what life was like during this historic event. Thanks as always for watching my video. If you have a question, feel free to comment or send me an email. Please stay healthy, wash your hands, and I'll see you back here next time.